Hey everybody, thank you for being here today. My name is Lonesome Walker, and I am, going to be talking about this show. The title of the show is Erotic City. It was made realistically in about, I'd say, a span of 7 or 8 weeks. There's only 2 pieces here that I did not create beforehand. One is the glory hole piece down here, although I did make the stand or the hangers for it. And then the other one is the enema piece above it. Everything else here was made on site, but a lot of it is found materials, salvaged materials, things from hardware stores, and also personal affects. A couple things that I wanted to talk about in the show, specifically because I made the show and what the show captures, is non-traditional pathways to creating art and to finding spaces for yourself to create art, and also anti-censorship in the arts, which I think are 2 very, very important things that not just are captured here in the work itself, but is kind of a lifelong project for me to work in and also engage with educational spaces and doing artist trades, skill sharing, things like that, always making sure there's as much accessibility as possible. So one of the ways I want to start talking about this is a little bit of my past, just as far as how I got here. Not just here in Tooth and Nail being the first exhibiting artist here, but also here in Milwaukee, and here with these pieces that have been made. So I actually don't have a traditional background in making art. I went to community college for many years. I would say about 12, 13 years, which is my pride and joy. I hope everybody gets to go to community college someday. There I was able to explore a lot, and while I was there, I actually did get a degree. I got a certificate in advocacy work that specialized in drug and alcohol counseling. And that trajected me to UC Santa Barbara, which I was able to transfer into when I was 28 years old. Originally intending to be a social worker. However, I interviewed every single social worker that I could find on campus, and I said, if you could give me one piece of advice for me to follow in this career, what would you say? And they said, don't be a social worker. A big reason why they said that wasn't just, this work is hard. They said this work is hard and it's rewarding. But the amount of red tape that you run into is not actually going to get you to the end goal of what you want to do. So what a lot of them said was, find the thing that makes the most sense for you, that you're passionate about, that you love, and follow that, because you're going to be able to do more direct action. You're going to be able to have more boots on the ground work. And you're going to be able to make more changes without as much red tape. And so with that, I ended up studying sociocultural linguistics with a specialization in studying deviance through vocabulary and in the communities. That way, just out of pure curiosity, no personal interest, I ended up specifically studying trans men and the idea of passing. So what passing means, for anybody who doesn't know that, is when the cisgender population, or anybody really, cis, trans, non-binary, read a trans person as a cis person. They can't read that that person is transgender. And that is something that a lot of people consider a goal. That is for some people, but that's not for everybody. And one of the things that I studied specifically in that was that you yourself, as a trans person, as a trans man, or whatever gender you are, you cannot decide if you are passing or not. It's actually the community around you that decides. It's the community that can look for details, that can find the minute things, that pass judgments. And once somebody finds out if you're trans or not, and this is, based on the studies that I did and the paper that I worked on, once people find you're trans, you will never actually pass for them ever again. They will constantly be holding that in their concept of you. And so a lot of that, I talked about deviance, I talked about what it means to exist in a society and what it means to either embrace those goals or to reject them. So while I was doing that, once again, not out yet, hadn't come out as trans, was almost in my 30s, and was looking into this, like I said, purely out of curiosity. I stumbled across a few trans men who were activists, who were artists and models, And one of the things that they said that I found absolutely true, and actually still find true to this day, about, what is that, 7 years later, 6 years later, and this is something that was said many, many, many years before when I read this, was that a lot of times the only time you can find information about trans people, see trans bodies, learns about trans health, is through porn, is through pornography. And specifically, it's pornography where it's usually exploiting trans people. It's usually having people paired in with cis people. And so you're still learning things from the lens of cisgender people. So that was something that really, really started factoring prominently in my work. Like I said, not all of this necessarily means that it's true. These are just the things that I was finding that were in print, that were in interviews, that were in books that I was reading. And so that is when pornography started showing up almost exclusively in my work. I started looking at it as, how can you find bodies that you want to draw? How can you find people who perhaps are being either used as objects, or you're looking at a mode of finding people like you, finding people who have lived experience that are beyond just the binary, that are beyond just normal life, aka just anything out of the most mainstream, and being able to embrace that as actually like exploring queer history, exploring trans history, exploring different ways of existing, and also finding joy, not just glimmers, but celebration of joy. And so these are two things that I really, really embraced with the work I did, and that's kind of what grew into this now. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But the idea of not exploitation, but joy, choice, wanting to be there, wanting to be seen, not wanting to pass, or embracing however you are and however you show up in every space. There should be spaces that prioritize people being as they are. And so this also was an idea of embracing, looking into, like I said, exploitation, but oppression, and in that lens, liberation. I think there's a lot of things that happen with trans people in art, with queer people in art, with those ideas, liberation in art, is people focus on the negative. They focus on the oppression. They focus on showing pain and people without. And for me, I wanted to look in these spaces and say, what would it be like to imagine my audience is trans? Everybody in my work is trans. Even too, with work I've done like this piece here and many, many others I've done, there's a lot of people who have reached out and say, hey, your work's great, but why are you only painting cis people? And that's one of the things I wanted to do, is push back and say, what tells you that these are two cis people? Why are you looking at bodies and still assuming that these are cis people? This, and it's not to say, I don't want to just like constantly grab negative conversations, and I don't constantly want to be saying and speaking out loud painful things that people say to trans people, to queer people, to non-binary people, to cis people who just aren't presenting in a way that people want to. So I don't want to speak those words, but I do want to say these are bodies that I read as queer. These are bodies that I read as trans, and it's kind of none of my business what my art is doing. And that's another thing I wanted to bring in. With making art and making art in non-traditional ways, what I want to bring up is that art is its own entity. Art is something that tells you what it needs to do. And that's also with the medium. So there's a lot of pieces here in this work and with my work in general. One of the reasons why I like using both organic shapes but also industrial things, like I have like clamp lights over here. I have all kinds, wood, scraps, leather, chains, whether they're, created by Janelle herself or ones that I use in other pieces. I want those things to tell me what they need to be. So one of the things that I made with this body of work was I decided, what would it be like to make a work with no censorship at all? So I've been put in positions where it's been this very conditional trust that happens. We trust that you're going to do the right thing, but I don't know what the right thing is, right? So being trusted to do the right thing, to impress people, to play by the rules, and only being told what those rules are and that you failed them until after you failed them, that has really stopped me from making work. That stopped me from exploring, because for me, I felt like I was censoring my own work. I was keeping my own voice out of the work that I wanted to do. I was making things that maybe other people liked but didn't feel true to the actual work that I wanted to make. And so when I met Janelle, and when I found out that she was dreaming about a space that was abolitionist, that was queer, that was creating space for artists, like truly, truly trying to figure out what artists want and what artists needed, we decided to partner and have space together where we would just, have ideas running back and forth. She invited me to be here after I lost as in I actively left a situation where I was being asked to censor my own work and therefore wasn't making work at all. And so she offered this to be a safe place to be while Tooth and Nail was being developed. And so being here with someone that I appreciate, that someone that I look up to, someone I admire, not only as a person but as an artist, who's very experimental, who's very exploratory, this is where this art was made, and it could not have been made anywhere else. Sharing this space with Coda, with Janelle, with Eileen, who came in here and was like helping build things. It was the four of us that made this work possible, and this is what I wanted to show, was collaboration, care, being yes-anded into being my best and weirdest and most experimental self. That was something I was invited to do every single day. And it was something that my friends saw, even though I was tired, even though I was buying the weirdest groceries that weren't probably the best for me to keep me running, right? That's constantly an artist's issue. But having people really see that I believed in this and that people around me believed in this helped me create an environment for this work to be made. And so there's a lot of things that I tried to do here that facilitated this. One of the things I did, which is how to eliminate hierarchy in your own creativity. So what I did was I kept a list. I had a handwritten list. I had one on my phone. Janelle and Coda and Eileen found all these weird scattered notes that were ripped out of pages, out of books, on receipts that were just like constant little sparks, whether it was a title of a piece or it was mediums that I wanted to use, or it's just like a little saying or glimmer that kind of reminded me of the things I wanted to do. I kept those lists with no hierarchy. So it wasn't just what I should make. If I want to make a piece about anti-censorship, I was not going to sit down and intellectually figure out what that was. I was going to write every single dumb idea I came up with and enjoy it and embrace it and play with and kind of pervert the idea of what a dumb idea is. It's something that's anti-institution. It's something that's anti-hierarchy. It's allowing yourself to play and be joyful. And so I kept that list, and whenever I sat down to make a piece, I didn't go through that list and say, what's the first thing I wrote down? What's the thing that's the boldest? What's the thing that's going to capture the actual spirit in the most literal way? I said, what's going to be fun to make today? And so I made pieces about enemas. I made pieces about masturbation myths. I made pieces about eating ass. I made pieces about, just joy and strangeness and taking all of these old and new screenshots and archives and ideas and playfulness and texts that people sent me, and I made them all together. A lot of these pieces were being made exactly at the same time, which was something we were all worried about as the date to show the work came closer and closer, and no one single piece was done. It meant that, 18 pieces were all done at the same time. Because, once again, there's no hierarchy here. So there's not one piece that needs to be made first. The pieces tell you what to do, the medium tells you what to do, and all these pieces said, we all need equal amounts of attention. So there's a lot of playfulness here, and I think that playfulness, I think that joy, I think that eroticism, I think that pleasure in all forms, I think that community, I think that saying what you mean, I think that experimenting is all what liberation looks like. I think there's this really, really important thing that I learned from one of my classmates and one of my mentors when I was at UC Santa Barbara, talked about was to join the liberation movement, to be able to show up and change the world as you want to see it, get in where you fit in. And that doesn't mean forcing yourself to be boots on the ground front line if you're not like that. I'm sure not. I have massive amounts of anxiety and I get hungry a lot. I can't be out there on the front lines constantly snacking. But what I can do is hear where people are, bring them food, cook for them, check in with them, see how they're doing, listen to them, figure out what people need emotionally. I'm a very good emotional caregiver, sometimes too much. I do get tired myself. I do need naps. But for me, I feel like that allowed me to show up and be a part of something that I always felt like I was on the fringes of, because I could never do the most obvious, capital letter social justice warrior stuff that people tell you to do. And so I think that for me, my other place that I fit in is telling people and reminding people what would it be like to actually achieve liberation. That means making whatever the fuck you want to make. It means finding whatever mediums you want to work in and experimenting. It means making mistakes. It means playing with your friends and having them yes and you, just like Janelle did, just like Coda did, just like Eileen did, just like all my friends did. Letting people participate in it, letting people have good, funny ideas, letting people laugh along with you, that is what liberation looks like. And if we forget what that looks like, we can't ever actually win. There are people who are actually just completely different on a cognitive, emotional, spiritual level than me that can handle being social workers, that can bump up against the red tape and say, I know how to get around this, or I know how to play with this. I know how to use this and pervert this to get exactly what I want. And those people I admire and I can support. I can check in with them at the end of the day and see how they're doing. I think there's people here who can also find the things that they want to do, being joyful, being angry, facilitating art making, facilitating free speech, building the places that we need to exist, live in, be joyful, practice our spirituality, have recreation. There's people who are doing all different kinds of things here. It's all valid as long as we do it. And so my role that I see personally is creating work that is fun, that is sexy, that is weird, work that people look at and say, I want to learn how to do that. I want the medium to show up so profoundly that someone can look at this and say, this is a window, and someone used paint on the other side of it, layered it differently, and it's an image. And I want to be able to make that and have someone go home and say, I can make that too. I want to be a springboard for other artists making work. I want to be a stepping stone for other people to constantly be playful, experimental, and take risks. Because I think that teaches you how to do that every single day. Whether that risk is telling people, I can't fucking make it out today, I gotta stay in bed. Whether that risk is, I'm gonna go to a place that I've never been to before, I don't know how to even get in the building, which so many of us felt like the first time they came to Lincoln Warehouse. I want people to be able to say, I want to show up to this thing and learn how to be here, learn how to find out who I am. I want people to figure out their sexuality, their gender, their chosen family, their real family, their futures as well as their pasts. Be able to embrace archive, being able to embrace, your local hardware store. Walk in there and say, how am I going to make giant breasts on a very terrifying, larger-than-life piece? Which I love my hardware store. True Value on Downer, shout out to them. They single-handedly got me through this show. But I really, really want my art to be that. Not only stand alone, but just be something that feels like a throughway or a passage into something bigger and better. So that's a lot of what my work is. There's two pieces that I do want to talk about to really highlight that. The first one is right behind me, and it is such a long and insufferable title that I have to look at it. So this piece is actually what started the show. This piece was the first one that out of everything I knew I had to make, and that piece was, I need to have Margaret Musa take a tintype of me taking a piss. I didn't know how that was going to look, but I thought that this is the thing that needs to be in this show. This is the piece that's going to make this happen. So this piece is very special to me, and for a lot of reasons, and I'll talk to you about that now. So this is titled, Bill poses for Margaret Musa while wearing an ash-colored Western hat, Roy Rogerson trigger watch with a leather band, and creamy cowboy boots of unknown origin while pissing on a genuine lambskin rug. I didn't want this piece to be titled something cheeky or clever, but of course it is titled something cheeky and clever because I am naming something extremely obvious. But the reason I wanted to make this was for two main reasons. One is that when I was researching anti-censorship in the arts, it kept bringing me back again and again to people using piss in art. Because it is something that is a daily, hopefully, daily, if not, daily, hourly, constantly, P.S., everybody drink water, always, always. But something that's just so human, something that's just so animal, something that's just so normal, and yet is one of the most, controversial things you can do in art. One piece that I saw in person, actually, when I was at, it was SF MoMA when I was in my early high school years, was Piss Christ, which was made in, I have notes over here, so I want to get it right. Let's see, where is that actually? So that was made by Andre Serrano, and that was in 1987. And it's incredibly controversial because it is a photograph that he took of a crucifix that's actually suspended in urine, his own urine. Now, this just became, as you can imagine, incredibly controversial. He lost grants because of it. He had honors taken away from him. He had, churches just going, blowing up, and it was such a scandal. This was just one of many, many pieces he did where he was exploring what it was like to suspend photographs in different fluids. That's what it was. If pushed, and I feel like a lot of artists are like this, where you're like, yeah, I can tell you why I use this medium. And then you're like, well, actually, also, I can think of maybe some political reasons why. Or some, not political reasons, but just some bigger, more cognitive reasons. And he talked about him being someone who actually is a very religious person, who does believe in Christ, who follows religion, who wanted to talk about how sad it was that there was a commercialization of religion. And so using urine and capturing a piece of his photography of a crucifix in this was a way of talking about that. It was not about pissing on religion. It was not about putting this thing that he holds very dear to him, to exploit it. And yet he was exploited by having this. The other piece that I remember, and honestly, it might have been at the same show, I also know it was at SF MoMA, was Fountain by Marcel Duchamp. And I just love how much it was not just an anti-art movement that he was trying to push, and that means, something by artists talking about ready-made objects, thinking about art outside of traditional pathways, but also just looking at objects and figuring out what the curatorial aspect of it is, and also taking just objects and seeing how they can sort of light up society. Fountain is a urinal turned on its side with Armut written on it. It was kept out of shows because people didn't want women to see something that referenced urination. And so those are just two of many, 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 many examples that I could go on and on and on about, that talk about urine, that talk about pissing, that talk about anything related to it. And so this piece I wanted to do is a sort of nod to the idea of anti-censorship. And that also includes showing trans bodies. How can I get a 2-for-1? So why don't I strip down naked and piss in front of a camera? I don't think there's an easier way of doing it. The other reason that I wanted to have a tintype was because I want to show that art is not made in isolation. I don't know how to run a tintype camera, but what I do know is someone who does. So I reached out to Margaret and I said, hey, Margaret, here's the deal. I really want to take this photograph. It's totally fine if you don't want to do it. It's totally cool. I still want to, commission you to take a cute portrait of me and my boyfriend. Absolutely, we can do things, the right way. And she was just like, oh my God, yes, when? I'm actually going to just put you on the calendar. Come over on the 5th. It's going to be amazing. And we were able to talk about the most fascinating things. If you're using urine as a medium, it's really, really fun to get into the nitty-gritty of the chemistry of it. I chugged water because I thought, oh, I don't want it to be gross when I'm peeing in front of my friend. And I show up and she says, I hope you're dehydrated because yellow actually shows up really, really well on tintypes. And if it's clear, it's not going to show up at all. And so I'm going, oh my God, what's going to happen? What do we have to do? Do we just have to be dehydrated for the rest of the day and we do this in the middle of the night? But what we decided to do was angle it so that there was a shadow on my leg in the photograph. And so the very clear, I was very hydrated urine falling would be captured because it would have light striking it where there's shadow behind it. So I want people to think about this piece as something that was this very, very thoughtful, very creative, joyful, loving, and it was this consensual and wonderful piece where I was met with just as much enthusiasm as I had. And then I also wanted to showcase not just the piece itself, but just sort of the humanity of it, keeping the hat here, bringing in this really ridiculous, urinal cake, which this is actually wood that I painted pink because nobody wants to smell that. And just find a way to elevate it, elevate friendship, elevate collaboration, elevate having this hat my dad gave me, that someone gave to him, that I love wearing. It's my date hat. It's my I'm showing up and showing off hat. And bringing it here, making this beautiful frame out of industrial wood and glue and paint, and just elevate what it means to collaborate with people. The other piece that I want to highlight, and I'll keep it a little bit shorter, we don't have to move, but this piece over here, the High Empress, or the High Priestess, this piece over here was another piece that I knew I wanted to make. It was one of the first pieces that I drew on this weird little receipt piece of paper, and I knew she needed to be big. I didn't know exactly what the work was going to be like, and so a friend of mine who cleans out warehouses, where apparently that's where all the good, cheap, nudie magazines of yore are. If you're going to buy them on eBay, they're like $1 million, but just find someone who cleans out houses. So I was gifted a bunch of them, and there's just this fantastic picture that when I flipped to it, I just knew I had to do. And Janelle said the same thing when I was able to show her what the reference photo was. Because of the negative space where the heels are, all of that just called, this is a challenge and it needs to be made. The reason I want to bring this up, this piece in particular, was because I knew I wanted to make this, but I felt a lot of pressure to be painting genitals in this show. Because we're talking about anti-censorship, because the censorship that I've experienced in my life has specifically been around the fact that I paint genitals, I felt the pressure to actually do it, and I just didn't want to work on the piece. It was one of the pieces that wanted to be made the most, and yet I felt so much resistance to it. So I called up my boyfriend, and I said, babe, I don't want to make a face because I don't want it to be something that is read in a certain way. I want people to look at my work and see themselves in it or see anybody in it. And that's a big reason why I don't use skin tones in my work. I don't want things to be a certain race, a certain ethnicity. What should I do where I'm not painting a specific face? And what do I do instead of painting genitals? And so, of course, Zach sent me literally a picture of an upside-down pineapple cake. And it wasn't just, oh, I'll do this. I was like, this is literally the most perfect picture. It's glistening, it's weird, it's so hyper-focused. And so I used that, and then I decided to do a Jell-O mold for the face. It is the most terrifying thing. I am literally scared of her so much. And I think that's the other thing, was that there's humor in it. It's funny. It's funny that there's an upside-down pineapple cake there. It's funny that I'm using Jell-O. It's funny that it's this big, beautiful, terrifying, takes up space, is the first thing you look at in this space piece. And I wanted to do something that also just made you feel like you didn't just read it and say, yeah, that's what the show is about. So that's another reason why I wanted to bring this up, was just the idea of collaboration and saying, reaching out to someone you trust, reaching out to someone who has the same sense of humor that you do, who has the same reverence for art that you do, and has the same idea of what anti-censorship should be. And instead of feeling pushed to make the most obvious choice for that piece, which was to make the most like, put all the genitals there, right? Put everything, or do a bunch of different faces, or write something on it, because I usually use a lot of words with my work, was instead to go with something that a very trusted person in my life could also laugh about, and also know that it was going to turn out well. And so those are the two pieces that I want to highlight as a way to kind of tie together how community, collaboration, humor, joy, and just day-to-day shit can be the things that really bring you to liberation and to break out of that sense of self-censorship and to learn how to take yourself out of being censored by institutions and people around you. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here.